Is it time to give up on most global funds for both active and passive investing? Generally, they have too much US exposure. A global developed world tracker will have about two-thirds exposure to the US. So if the US catches a cold or if the US dollar weakens, then there could be a problem that infects the whole of your portfolio. Now, people are always saying that the US market is overpriced, and that's not really always the case because generally a lot of the best businesses in the world are located there. But it might be worthwhile having a different look at your US exposure and managing it more actively. So for passive funds, it's a great idea to keep on top of some of the innovation in the exchange traded fund space. So there's now a developed world ex-US exchange traded fund, and the ticker is XMWX. So now there's no need for lots of different regional funds if you want to effectively manage your non-US exposure. You can just hold the S&P 500 and then this developed world ex-US. You could have maybe 50% in each, or you could just moderate your exposure depending on your preferences and how you thought the world might pan out in the next year or so. But you can even take things a step further and look at modifying your US exposure. So there are exchange traded funds that are just equal weight for the S&P 500. So they've got like 0.2% in every single company in the S&P 500. And there's even now a new ETF from Legal & General, which is the S&P 100 equal weight. So it's the 100 largest companies on the US stock markets, and they're all there at 1%, and the ticker is SPEG. It's a new ETF, so not all brokers stock it yet, but it'll be interesting to see what happens with this ETF in the future. And what I like about it is that I think there's probably only around 100 great companies in the US anyway, in terms of ones with a global exposure and multiple product ranges, so they're better able to ride out economic turbulence. And as you go further down the S&P 500, you get things like regional banks, you get US utilities, you get maybe US house builders. So there's kind of a lot of exposure to the US domestic economy, and maybe companies that just aren't so great. They're something like the third largest paint manufacturer in the world because their management isn't as good as the global leader in that market. So I'm quite keen on having really large and solid companies in my portfolio. So I'm looking forward to seeing how well this ETF might perform. And so now if we look at active global funds, there's not that many that consistently outperform. And some have a bit more of a you only live once, a sort of a bit more of a technology bias to them. So they're things like maybe Blue Whale, where you're probably just better off buying the NASDAQ rather than a global growth orientated fund. And these funds can be quite concentrated in their holdings. So they're like Fundsmith, and we all know what's happened to Fundsmith. There are some other ones that are global in nature that do perform strongly with the value bias, and probably the best example of that is Ranmore Global Equity, and I do hope that that continues to do well. I am a big fan of Sean Pesh, and there's lots of information about this fund in the II community if you want to learn more about it. I've also done a video on it that's worth watching. And the problem with active funds not beating the market is that the S&P 500 recently has just been very difficult to beat, that the largest companies have just kept on growing, and they've all been in a sort of technology related space, and it's been quite difficult for an active fund to pick companies that outperform the Magnificent Seven and to put together a portfolio that isn't just accused of being an index hugger anyway. And something like JP Morgan American, the investment trust, has done quite a good job of trying to beat the S&P 500, and it's kind of done it by a slim amount depending on the time frame you use, but arguably it's not a consistent enough beat to look at taking the extra risk of having an active fund in that space. And the fact is that an S&P 500 tracker is just so cheap, and active funds in the US space still come in at close to 1% in terms of fees. So really, even if you're a big fan of active funds, I think when it comes to the US, you're probably better off sticking to the S&P 500. But where you could get solid outperformance is in other markets. So an example might be some of the Artemis products have done really well recently. Their Smart GARP range, which is growth at a reasonable price, does well in markets such as Europe and the UK. And you can get a team that have a long tenure, and eventually they get real expertise in the concentrated markets that they're analyzing, and that can be a reason for outperformance. Whereas if you're looking at the whole world, there's just so many companies to consider, it can be very difficult to keep capturing the right trends early enough to get decent solid performance. So I would recommend looking from time to time at some of these country or regional funds that do seem to have strong performance, and you can maybe put together a logical argument as to why they do quite well. So I'm definitely a believer that you should have both active and passive funds in your portfolio. The active funds can act as a diversifier and possibly lead to either more smooth out returns or maybe even greater returns. And if you want to see my pension portfolio, you can get an account with Interactive Investor, join their community, and you can find it all there. And I'll put a link in the description as to how you can do that. And if you want to watch a video of funds that I currently like, then I'll put a link to that as well.